Greetings from LA, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journeys, our discussions, our discoveries, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2023. And that brings us to a title which has been designated by Criterion at spy number 1198. And this is a title which is on the 4K UHD plus Blu-ray combo edition format. It is of a film which is described as being from the year 1973. The name of the filmmaker is Martin Scorsese, and the name of the work is Mean Streets. This is the work, the utterly electrifying and very provocative and very challenging and truly personal works, which is described as being from the year 1973, and it is from the filmmaker, the director, Martin Scorsese. Screenplay by Martin Scorsese and Mardik Martin, and producer Jonathan Taplin, director of photography Kent Wakeford, with a wonderful selection of music for its audio soundtrack landscape. And it has many strengths. Among such strengths is the cast, the brilliant cast, included in which are, for example, Harvey Keitel and Amy Robinson and Robert De Niro and others. And I'm speaking, of course, of this work, which is on the table in front of me, and the disc is in the player behind me here. I'm speaking of this, which is the captivating film, Mean Streets. Mean Streets is now in the Criterion Collection physical media catalog, courtesy of this very intriguing release in 2023. We will speak a little bit later, if you don't mind, my dear friends, about certain aspects of, say, the presentation. It is a 4K restoration, and we have aspects of this. This is the 4K UHD plus Blu-ray combo edition, and so we'll speak a little bit about aspects of that as well as the very, I think, very provocative and stimulating discussions that are had in the context of the supplements and the selected scene commentary, which we will also talk about here as well. But before we do that, my dear friends, let us turn our attention, if we may, to the basic story or plot structure of this film. It is set in New York City, sort of contemporary New York City of the times, 1970. So it's set in that time. There's some interesting details about the production, where it was actually filmed, etc. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we get to the supplements. But as far as the film is concerned and the world of the film, it is set in New York City, and we have a very interesting sort of milieu, day-to-day activities or day-to-day life, days in the lives of type of approach. Now, these are characters that we understand fairly early on have a link or are part of many different, say, avenues or aspects of society and culture and life. So part of it is growing up in this part of the world, New York, and Italian-American life, and also the aspects of family and culture and heritage. And for some characters in particular, we see through the landscape, through the perspective of Charlie. This is the Harvey Keitel character, with a little bit of Martin Scorsese sprinkled into the mix of the audio, by the way. But when we see and hear the engagement of this character in particular, vis-a-vis religion and religious views and religious takes, specifically the idea of form and type of maybe a type of atonement, or religion as sort of an institution with ways and forms and ceremonies on the one hand, but also trying to find a way to uh, create a sense or apply or otherwise live the principles of the religious principles of that Charlie views and espouses or seems to espouse or seeks to espouse, tries to live those principles in the moments of his daily life. And that brings us to his relationship, or one of the key relationships that he has with another key character in this film, that is Johnny Boy, and this is the character portrayed by Robert De Niro. Now, before I get to that, I should also bring into the picture the other aspects of these characters specifically, that some of them we understand are part of or have linkages to, or the notion is that there might be some dealings with maybe petty crime, or maybe even to a certain degree organized crime somewhat higher up on the food chain, so to speak. When we focus on our main characters here, like Johnny Boy, Charlie, or other characters like Michael, we realize that maybe some of them are a little bit more involved or a little bit higher up in the hierarchy than others. Maybe not as much as, say, other major figures in this area of life with these characters, but they do have a certain degree of, say, positioning, and so that also means that they have, to some degree or another, some kind of involvement with petty crime. And we see those situations play out sometimes in a comedic way, in terms of trying to get money, trying to collect on debts, sometimes in a way that is very shocking and explosive. There are moments where violence erupts in this world, and violence can erupt suddenly on a dime without any type of warning. Word, it can just there's one moment of relaxing and just having a good time, and a night out in the bar, in the club, with its wonderful bright red decor, almost hellish decor on the one hand. And then all of a sudden, things can erupt into a swirl of violence, whether it be a brawl between other customers in the bar. All of a sudden, that might threaten to turn into a fist fight, or it might be even something even more deadly and serious involving guns and shootings. And any other bursts of violence that are on the screen. This is also something that we understand as part of the daily life of these characters that we meet, Michael, Charlie, and Johnny Boy. And I mention this as well because there is this element of organized crime somewhere in the periphery, somewhere in the distance. There is some kind of connection somewhere in the distance, but we understand that people like characters like that we meet here, like Charlie and others, they seem to be somewhat lower on the rungs of, say, the hierarchy, as it were. So that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that they aren't busy. In fact, they are, as the film charts, because there are, as I say, day-to-day goings-on, days in the lives of type of approach, and there's also the notion of characters just hanging out, or just being with friends, or just wanting to have a night out, or meeting other people. And so it has that type of relaxed flow to it, which I think allows for real shining moments of day-to-day banter. I mean, I love the moments and scenes that the film allows for, where we have, say, Charlie and Johnny Boy's interactions that have a almost stand-up comic routine about them, and it has a type of who's on first pace to it, almost akin to even like a Howard Hawks film, in a manner of speaking, as well as the stand-up comedy routine, which I think is really lovely. And by the way, it's nice to see, and I don't want to stress this too much, but it's nice to consider maybe other films that might occur later in the Scorsese filmography canon that have both Harvey Keitel and Robert De Niro, and indeed, even in those later films and those scenes, there is still this type of who's on first stand-up comedy type of banter between them in some scenes in later films that I think is very much at the core, or one of the cores of this film, Mean Streets. So the chemistry between the characters and the friendship and the day-to-day goings-on that has with it, say, nights out, petty crimes, collecting money, collecting on debts, but then also bursts of violence. And you throw into the mix here a number of, say, intensified plot points that become even more and more and more intense as the film progresses. So I'm talking first about a plot point that's introduced fairly early on involving a debt, Johnny Boy, and money owed. And this is forming a kind of tense relationship between the named characters early on in the film, and those being Tony and Charlie and Michael and Johnny Boy. But specifically, Johnny Boy and Michael, because we understand that some kind of money is owed, and Johnny Boy seems to be having some trouble paying back the debt on time. And so it seems that Charlie, who is trying his best to look out for Johnny Boy as a type of friend or favor, but perhaps there's something more that we'll touch upon momentarily, is trying to intervene in a way that will try to maintain peace in this otherwise topsy-turvy yet day-to-day world. So therein lies one, say, plot point that has the potential of intensifying more and more and more. And then there is also the relationship that is had between and among Johnny Boy and Teresa and Charlie, and the relationship, the intimate, romantic, and sexual relationship between Charlie and Teresa, and how this also has the potential of intensifying more and more, especially when we recall some of the earlier and other parallel plot threads that have to do with Johnny Boy's character arc and trajectory. And also, these plots allow for a kind of introspection or examination, or perhaps even intrusion upon the viewpoint and the perspective, the gaze, if you will, in particular of Charlie vis-a-vis religion, and how his viewpoints, as he expresses them directly to the audience in either his voice or Harvey Keitel's voice, or sometimes maybe even in the voice of Martin Scorsese, its actual voice, but how this allows for a type of direct confrontation or direct revelation to us, the viewer and the audience, vis-a-vis his viewpoints on sex and religion, and his perspective as he espouses, or as he not espouses it necessarily, but as he addresses it in the film, his position vis-a-vis his perspectives on gender roles and on women, and this is in the context of his relationship with Teresa, and also his viewpoints on race, which also have a direct and indirect discussion point here as well, that have a very raw and very a quite, I think, confrontational aspect to it. But we also have to remember they are raw, and they're also very, very personalized to the trajectory of Charlie. And also, part of that highly intense and personalized viewpoint on religion vis-a-vis his own life is directed towards his relationship with Johnny Boy. And herein lies, I think, one of the key constructive and perhaps potentially destructive aspects of Charlie's relationship and viewpoint and worldview. Namely, is what he is doing, in other words, trying to help a friend in need in terms of Johnny Boy's debt to Michael, is what Charlie is doing here a type of act of grace and salvation? Is it a type of self-imposed pain and suffering? Is it a type of over-glorified arrogance? Is this a type of highly, is this an arrogant way of viewing the world? In other words, he positioning himself as the type of savior figure, and is that itself a quote-unquote reasonable application of these principles of religion in Charlie's life, or is this a perversion or warped way by which Charlie is trying to apply his perspectives on these principles vis-a-vis his relationship with Johnny Boy? And indeed, this has the potential not just of a type of road to salvation, but also has the potential of turning quite ugly. And if we remember too, and we describe this world, Mean Streets, things can get very, very violent very quickly. And so it has that explosive, out of the blue, all of a sudden, type of powder keg quality of eruptions of violence That is due to the pressures, that is due to, say, heightened emotions of the characters due to external circumstances that may or may not be beyond the control of the characters themselves. But if you combine that type of potential for violence and explosiveness, combine that with this discussion point about the quote-unquote road to salvation, and query whether that is indeed a road to salvation or another form of a type of subjective arrogance. You combine those, I think, complex details and perspectives, as well as other raw and highly personalized approaches to life and sex and life on the streets and day-to-day goings-on and petty crime and the like. You have this world which is both fascinating and highly absorbing and very inviting, but also very scary and very threatening and quite highly and intensely pressurized indeed. And it's that type of viewpoint where we see depicted through the lens of Martin Scorsese and all of the wonderful style and tricks of the camera and uses of cutting and application of very interesting use of dialogue superimposed or narration or voiceover, etc. This is the stuff of highly electrified, raw, intense cinema that is presenting something that is highly intensified, raw, and very, very personal. So you have style and substance meeting in this this explosive way. That is the film Mean Streets. So there is much here. There's much to digest, and it is very confrontational. I mean, some parts I know may even be offensive, but this is the terrain of the raw and personal and intensely personal journey that I think this film undeniably is. And in that way, I think it comes with a sense of context, and it comes with a sense also of exploration. And that's one of the great things I think about a Martin Scorsese film. When Mean Streets, I think, is a great example of this, and it's very much true for many other wonderful landmark works in the Scorsese canon, namely that we are oftentimes confronted, we the viewers are oftentimes confronted or asked to engage in the world of characters that we may or may not necessarily understand completely, and we may or may not necessarily sympathize with completely on that front. There might be things that we see on display that are maybe personally repellent or ugly to us. But there is a way in which Scorsese, I think, allows for that room, and indeed allows for the nurturing of that type of complex relationship between the viewer, the spectator, and the film, and still allows for, I think, an acknowledgement of the electrifying nature of the engagement at hand. And so I think that for me, that's what goes on all the time in this great way. I mean, again, I don't want to go too much off track here, but you think of other examples like Raging Bull or Goodfellas or Casino or The Irishman, and Mean Streets is, I think, a brilliant example of that. I mean, it's a kind of love-hate relationship, and it's that love-hate relationship swirled with a sense of raw, intense, personal, with bursts of violence and also bursts of the truly intimate and raw, naked power. That is also very funny and very witty and very clever and very stand-up comedy like nurtured humanity. That also, because of I think the intense personal nature of it, there's also ways in which we see perspectives that are warped, that are also perverse, that are also very shocking and scary. That is the whole package of sort of portraits of humanity that I think are very honestly rendered and are so very earnestly and in beautiful good faith rendered by Martin Scorsese and company when you have a film like Mean Streets. And I should point out too that just a few other things here. I mentioned style, the cinematic style, and there is this film weaves in and out of a type of style that is very, I think, provocative. I love how it has aspects of when you have some of the footage that is undeniably outside New York street landscapes. It has a feeling of Little Italy, and some aspects of the part of the neighborhood. We and like maybe windows and maybe door stops or door fronts or and the like, and streets and the storefronts, etc., and driving down streets. We have this view of New York at the time, which has almost a documentary feel to it, because it feels very much authentic and lived in. And this is remarked somewhere in the supplements, which we'll get to as well momentarily. But so on the one hand, I love how it has, for lack of a better phrase, maybe a cinema verite quality to it, but it is self-acknowledged to be a narrative film. And at the same time, there is also these sweeps of cinematic and editing verve that are very like a French nouvelle vague or new wave. The way that certain jump cuts are applied, even the opening pre-title sequence with Charlie laying down on his pillow after waking up, all of a sudden laying down, and before or as the music bursts onto the soundtrack, we have a cut right down to his face. I mean, this is very much like out of Godard or Truffaut from 1960s Nouvelle Vague, or other things too, like the way the camera is mounted from behind Charlie at one moment at his dancing through the bar, as the Rolling Stones are on the soundtrack. But then sometime later we have a similar yet very optically different perspective from showing his face almost in a drunken stupor. Which is becoming more and more chaotic as the minutes pass, and so these come out of nowhere. Also, the way that sound is used. Suddenly, we see bursts of violence, and suddenly sound is blocked out of the soundtrack in a very interesting way. Even the handheld camera in sudden bursts of, say, fight sequences that suddenly have this gliding, controlled motion. Even within, on a cut as well. So, and then you also have the way that names are superimposed onto the film. So these are very quote unquote artificial, non-real sequences or cinematic stylings that are combined with, at the same time, a sense of the authentic, a sense of the real. And I love that. I really love that. It plays with the notion that I think is also very much part of Scorsese's canon. You see it all the way up to like films like Raging Bull, and even up to his documentary work, and then work like The Irishman or Killers of the Flower Moon. Even this idea of what is quote unquote real and what is quote unquote authentic, what is quote unquote the real history, and what is quote unquote the very obviously stylized artificial stuff. What is truth and what is the lie? And I mean lie not in a derogatory way, but I mean it in a type of cinematic, artful way. And so this, I think, is even embedded so skillfully and very poetically in a work like Mean Streets at the very get-go. So in that way, I think this film is just a great hallmark of the type of a real explosive nature of seemingly contradictory styles that are combined in this very confrontational and staggering and authentically feeling way, which I think is just a hallmark of Scorsese's talent, and also that of his cinematic collaborators. And we should mention Martin here as an example. We'll mention Martin here a little bit later. Also, the great camera work by Kent Wakeford. We'll also mention that in the context of a supplement a little bit later. And speaking also of other artistic collaborators, the performances here are just out of this world, and sometimes they're very difficult, and they're very compromising, and they're very almost revealing, emotionally and spiritually naked. And this is, I think, the great strength and the bravery, and also the charm and the wit of these performances. And I'm speaking, for example, of the performance of A.B. Robinson, who has, I think, a really challenging role in terms of trying to establish this emotional connection and this emotional weight, while also being a type of threat in terms of what Charlie's perspective is on on his own life, as well as his views on sexuality, as well as his relationship with Johnny Boy, and also the relationship between Johnny Boy and Teresa, which is also very key. So that's a very key role, and Amy Robinson, I think, does just a brilliant job. And I have to mention, of course, Harvey Keitel as Charlie, who has this sense of, say, maybe a external surface leadership or potential for leadership as a type of anchor, but actually, when we examine further, we realize just the degree of tumult and insecurity that he may have vis-a-vis how he views the external world, like his relationship with Johnny or Teresa or Michael, etc., or how he views himself, and that brings with it a lot of these wonderfully rendered introspective monologues, right? About things like pain and hell and suffering and salvation, right? And the duality and the split, the schism and the conflict, right? And how he's trying to transfer that, transfer what he identifies early on, Charlie does, as a type of ceremony of religion, which is, all-encompassing and beautiful. And he respects that quite dearly, but he also says that he wants to do it in his words, his own way, and he recognizes what the pain in hell. Pain in hell has two sides: the kind you can touch with your hand, the kind you can feel in your heart. Soul, the spirituals, and the worst of the two is the spiritual. That's I paraphrased that quote from Mean Streets early on. So he recognizes too the impulse to want to make corporeal that which is ethereal, which I think is a very profound journey. It has all sorts of religious and existential implications, and it's made flesh in the journey of Charlie vis-a-vis this performance by Harvey Keitel. I mean, it's also this wonderful it's discussed too in some of the supplements here about how this is a continuation of an earlier work, Who's That Knocking at My Door, but and the sort of continuation of another character that we'd seen there, who's also played by Harvey Keitel in that film, who's referred to there as J.R. But there is this idea of the tension or the conflict, and I think Harvey Keitel's performance embodies that impeccably. And then we have Johnny Boy, who's portrayed by Robert De Niro, who has this explosive nature. I mentioned how Mean Streets, the environment, as shown in Mean Streets here, has this way of turning violent on a dime, and all of a sudden, without any kind of warning. That's, in many ways, one can say that Johnny Boy, as portrayed by Robert De Niro here, is an embodiment of that. There is this edgy, almost jittery, never calm nature. I mean, you see, even when he's sitting down in the car, you see he's fidgeting with his hands. He's biting on his nails, or just looking around and not quite sure. And there's suddenly bursts of violence, and then trying to make do like things are okay, where in fact things are not okay, and they become more and more and more not okay as things progress. So, but that type of almost devil-may-care, hellish devil-may-care attitude embodied in this cool veneer and attitude and type of charm, and also a real moments of potential self-awareness too. Again, going back to this idea of a type of potentially a patronizing attitude that maybe people have of him in this world, and how he feels about that, and how it relates to him and his own introspective journey, and how he may potentially lash out against that. So all this stuff is embodied in Robert De Niro's performance, and it is one of the reasons why Robert De Niro's Robert De Niro is Robert De Niro, and 1970s Robert De Niro roles, and in particular the relationship between De Niro and Scorsese. Mean Streets is one of the great hallmarks of that. So the performances here in Mean Street, and many others, and then the soundtrack and the musical choices and the like. Whew. Mean Streets. Mean Streets. And I'm sorry, maybe I'm just I'm taking too long with this. I apologize, but let me just say one more thing too, and we'll go to another discussion of the supplements, etc. Is that I remember this was one of the early films that I saw by Martin Scorsese, somewhat early on in my life. I remember first seeing this when I was a teenager. And this was around the time, it was coinciding around the time that I was beginning to discover cinema. I'd always loved watching movies and watching films and watching cinema, but I was beginning to discover cinema and taking classes. And one of the first film classes I ever took was a film class that was talking about, among other things, Scorsese films. And one of the first films that we saw in one of my first film classes that I ever took was the film Mean Streets, and it was awe-inspiring. And some of the commentary in those classes I still remember about just little details, like I love the timing when you have the it happens very very early on in the opening credits of the film Mean Streets. Opening credits has this wonderful montage of home film footage, camera footage, and it's edited, spliced into home movies, and with the titles sort of, and then we have the frame and the camera, or the projector, excuse me, that is also being shot, and we go into the light projector, and then we go into the screen. So there's a screen within a screen, and then we hear the music overlaid, and we see these home movie footage as the titles are sort of around the screen or across the screen, as the case for Mean Streets goes. And note the timing of the director credit, Martin Scorsese. It's where Harvey Keitel is shaking hands on the steps outside of a church with a priest. And it's the point when he joins hands with the priest that we see the title credit, director Martin Scorsese. And I remember this was such a great discussion point in that film class for many nearly 20 or 30 minutes. The strong symbolism of that, and how this is so important, therefore, as a type of image to Martin Scorsese himself, in his own self-described viewpoints and takes and biographical details in his own life vis-a-vis his family and religion. So the moment that his cinematic counterpart, that being the Harvey Keitel character, shakes hand with a priest in the home movie section of the opening titles, this is the moment where Martin Scorsese's name appears. And so it's little details like that I will never be able to forget. It's one of the most joyous moments of my own cinema journey, discovering cinema in this way, and in that discovery, part of that, or within that, or one of the great examples of that discovery for me in my own cinema journey when I was a teenager, was the film Mean Streets in that film class. So, but in any event, yes, this film holds a very special place in my heart, and it continues to do so. And with releases like the Criterion Collection, I dare say to you that this film will continue to be very important to me, and I will continue to revisit and revisit and revisit it many, many times to come, till the day I die. This is the work which is Mean Streets. The Criterion Collection has released this film, Mean Streets, courtesy of this new 4K UHD plus Blu-ray combo edition format, and this is at spine number 1198. It is a 2-disc release, at least this is what I have here, and the one disc being the 4K UHD disc, and the other disc being the Blu-ray disc. This is a plastic casing. The 4K UHD disc is in fact what I have in the player right now. This is purported to be based on a new 4K digital restoration approved by director Martin Scorsese and collaborator Thelma Schoonmaker, with uncompressed monaural soundtrack. This is interesting because this film, Mean Streets has been released a number of times before on previous physical media releases. For example, I have an earlier non-Criterion Blu-ray, the Warner Brothers Blu-ray from some years back, which has the film and also some special features that we see, for the most part, carried over into this Criterion release. We'll talk about the supplements momentarily. As I mentioned, the film can be found on the 4K disc or on the Blu-ray disc, but the supplements will be found on the Blu-ray disc. But before we get to the supplements, I should make a note here. We have the leaflet, which has, among other things, the wonderful artwork. We'll talk about the wonderful artwork a little bit later, but part of the notes that are part of this fold-out insert are notes about the master. And I quote, "Mean Streets is presented in its original aspect ratio of 1.85 to 1. Approved by director Martin Scorsese and collaborator Thelma Schoonmaker, this new digital master was created from the 35mm original camera negative, which was scanned in 4K resolution on a laser graphics director film scanner. The original monaural soundtrack was remastered from the 35mm DME magnetic track by the Criterion Collection. The feature is presented in Dolby Vision HDR, high dynamic range, on the 4K Ultra HD disc, and high definition SDR, standard dynamic range, on the Blu-ray." Mastering supervisors Martin Scorsese, Thelma Schoonmaker, and Lee Klein. So I have seen this film a lot of times prior to the Criterion release, and I've seen it on VHS. I've seen it on multiple releases since then, and many since some time back, since I was a teenager. I've never seen this, however, projected on film on a movie theater screen, unfortunately. So my frame of reference is very limited, I acknowledge. So with that information, with that limited frame of reference, I come to this Criterion release, and I note that there are some, I would say, maybe minor yet still perceptible differences. Not throughout, but every once in a while. In particular, the way that certain outdoor scenes look. There is a slightly, for lack of a better phrase, a slightly warmer, very, very slightly warmer quality to some of the outdoor scenes. It has a maybe not quite orangish, but maybe a kind of yellow tint to it. Or perhaps a better way to put it is, I note that some of the, let's take another example, some of the indoor scenes that involve, say, darkened rooms or maybe low lit rooms, when they appeared on some of the on, say, the earlier Blu-ray when I watched it, there was a lot of darkness to those, and it almost to the point where it was almost totally enveloped in a sort of darkness, certain corners of the room. Whereas here, those same scenes have a slightly, not overly cast, but slightly cast a degree of, say, one level degree of warmth to them. And I point, for instance, there's a scene in the bar where Harvey Keitel and Robert De Niro are then by themselves. You can see when they're entering into the room, there's a slight difference, or at least I can see a slight difference. It is, I think, the effect that it has on me is it makes me look, and what I did was I watched the film, the Criterion release, a number of times, and then I revisited the earlier Blu-ray release that I have, and the psychological effect on me I thought was very interesting. I found that there was a, for lack of a better phrase, a type of warmth that wasn't entirely absent in the earlier Blu-ray that I had seen when I'd seen it, or entirely absent in my approach to the earlier Blu-ray. But I did feel like this earlier Blu-ray had the psychological effect on making me feel like it was a little bit colder. The temperature was a little bit colder in the rooms. Whereas the psychological effect on me when I was watching the Criterion release was that I wasn't feeling as much of the temperature climate chill. I was feeling it being a little bit warmer in terms of temperature. Now, I think that it's a very interesting perspective, and I am aware of, say, certain discussions, shall we say, online that are had or that are being had with regard to this recent Criterion release and the restoration that is the basis or the premise of this release. And it might not necessarily be there might be some reaction to it based on certain differences that are being perceived. I can say that I'm aware more or less of that conversation, but I feel like it has a type of warmth which I think is not to the extent of a nostalgia tinted warmth, but rather it's a way in which I'm feeling the temperature slightly differently. And when I think about the way that sudden bursts of violence occur in the film, and I think about the extreme degree of hot passion, let's put it that way, and the hot and the extreme degree of hot and red and hell. When I think of it that way, I am finding myself more and more enamored by a reaction to the film where I'm feeling warmth or I'm getting a sense of warmth. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, this is a film about hell. This is a film about hell, and so my image or my understanding of hell is heat and flame and fire. We see it indeed in some of the early opening sequences of the film. The flame of the candle and trying to hold one's hand over the candle. This idea of heat, I think, is it made me more aware of this, perhaps even on a subliminal level, and perhaps on a direct level when I saw the Criterion release. Not to say that it was completely absent for me when I watched the earlier Blu-ray release, but I feel like there is this warmth which I don't think is, considering the way I'm viewing the film and the idea of perspectives on religion, kind of self-sacrifice, infliction of pain. This infliction of pain is visualized or made manifest in the images of fire and heat and hell and reds, the color red. I don't think that type of reading or that psychological effect of this presentation that is had on me, I don't think that is in any way inconsistent with the film, and therefore I find it to be a very interesting, new step in how to view this film going forward. Again, I don't see it as a huge difference in what I have seen thus far with this film with previous releases. So I don't consider it a huge gap. I find them to be very, very close in terms of this visual style. But there is, I think, a noticeable psychological effect that is had on me. And I, for one, don't consider it at all negative. I think, as I say, it feels like it is very much consistent and in keeping with what I feel, for me, the film does for me, and how I personally read the film. So for others, perhaps it might be different. For others who see the film or have a specific reading of the film, this presentation may or may not be consistent to that reading, which is, I think, a very legitimate and reasonable response to have to this or to any film. But I can speak only from my own perspective when I say that I found it to be very, not just consistent, but also augmenting and enhancing these aspects of the film as I read them. And the notions of hell and hot and pain and suffering and salvation, all wrapped into this notion of heat and warmth and the reds. This, I think, is maybe subliminally and perhaps even directly suggested in the way that I view the presentation of this film as it appears in the Criterion release. So, I am a fan. So now let us turn our attention to the supplements. So once again, this is a 2-disc release, one disc being the 4K UHD disc, and the other being the Blu-ray disc. The film can be found on either the 4K disc, or it can be found on the 4K disc, and it can be found on the Blu-ray disc. But the supplements can only be found with the Blu-ray disc, and that includes what's described as the scene select or selected scene commentary, which we'll get to momentarily. But I have the Blu-ray in the machine right now, and as you can see, well, maybe you can't because my focusing camera work is very, very poor, so I apologize for that. But I'm moving the selection of the main menu from movie to now chapters and now to supplements, and then bottom here is subtitles. If I go to supplements, I press that and it comes up with a number of supplements here. I mentioned too that there was the earlier Warner, not DVD, Blu-ray, and the earlier Warner Blu-ray does have some two supplements, in fact, and well, a few supplements, and so we can speak to those because they do appear, for the most part, in the presentation or the collection of supplements by Criterion. It's a great collection, by the way, and it starts with Martin Scorsese with Richard Linklater. This is the following excerpted conversation was originally recorded in 2011 by the Directors Guild of America for a special screening of Mean Streets. So this is in 2011. It's approximately 30 minutes. The writer, director, artist Richard Linklater is speaking in front of the theater audience, and he's speaking first about his view and take on Mean Streets. As he calls it a game changer. He calls it also, he recognizes the biographical or autobiographical aspects of the film and the idea of stories and the reality of these stories. And also references to earlier Scorsese films, specifically Who's That Knocking at My Door, and the character in that film called J.R., which has, I think, very strong links, or perhaps even a spiritual connection, or maybe a spiritual twin, or an act with the character of Charlie, portrayed by the same actor, Harvey Keitel, this time in this film, Mean Streets. And then the supplement, this discussion then turns to an onstage sit-down conversation between the two artists, Scorsese and Richard Linklater, in front of the live audience. And so we have this discussion between the two, and then Richard Linklater is asking questions and essentially interviewing Scorsese. It's interesting to see Richard Linklater and his reactions as Scorsese is speaking. You can tell that Linklater is such a fan of Scorsese and his work in Mean Streets that he's kind of, maybe it's the mic that it's off, but it's like he's lovingly repeating certain aspects of what Scorsese is saying. It's a lovely touch, and it just shows the depth, I think, of respect and awe that Richard Linklater is feeling at that moment. And it's such a genuine, he's coming from such a genuine place, and I love that very much. And the topic of conversation, or the topics of conversation, are of course surrounding Mean Streets, such as certain inspirations, collaborations, homages, or like references, names mentioned like Roger Corman, Cassavetes are mentioned, and also working in terms of the shooting style and the way that it was sort of arranged and funded, etc., and how it was arranged in terms of the amazing thing about this film is that it had a large portion of the film is actually shot in Los Angeles or in California. And I think a lot has to do with maybe some of the indoor scenes in particular. There are outdoor scenes in this film that are very undeniably New York. Obviously New York, because they are in New York. But other scenes that are, say, indoors, for example, are examples of where this film, we understand it, was actually shot in locations in Los Angeles. So it is known as a New York film. From Scorsese, who is described and also self-described as a New York filmmaker in many respects. But it's interesting to understand or to hear about this detail of the production. A large component of this film being shot and being filmed in California area. So that's very interesting. I think at one moment, Scorsese says during the conversation, he says, "It's what it is." So I really love that moment. It's what it is. So those of you who know Scorsese films, maybe you know what film I'm referring to, but yes, it's what it is. And it's also talking about the New York Film Festival and how this film got its real jump start, because when it landed, it really landed, and it became this critical almost phenomenon in the way that many critics and audiences were reacting to this, and also filmmakers like Richard Linklater, who came to this film and then realized that this was something that it not only was so raw and personal, but it was something that people recognized that it was like this wonderful home movie as well, and I mean that very complimentarily. There's a great way in this film inspired other filmmakers in that current and also future generations, and also wonderful parallels too in terms of other filmmakers of Scorsese's generation, like Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas and Lucas' work, American Graffiti, etc., and the casting. So this is overall, I think, a wonderful discussion. And it's lovely to see Scorsese's spirit and Richard Linklater's questions and respect and awe. Lovely to see the reactions. The Scorsese laugh is there. The way he laughs, I think, is really quite wonderful. So this is the discussion. Martin Scorsese with Richard Linklater. This is from 2011, approximately 30 minutes. Then we have what's called selected scene commentary. So this is very interesting. When you press this button, it says, the following audio commentary, originally recorded in 2004, features director Martin Scorsese and actor Amy Robinson. So Amy Robinson plays a very key role in this film. And you press it, and it doesn't go to the main film. What it goes to the film, or the most of the film, not the entire film, but most of the film, with the commentary track over it. And it does have chapters, but it's like you're getting a chunk of the film again when you press the play button. So it's not like you watch the main film or the film on the main feature and then you can select the commentary track option. At least that wasn't the case for me when I pressed my buttons on the remote control. But I had to go to the Blu-ray menu, supplement submenu, and then go to the selected scene commentary. Because what this is it's not the entire film, but it's most of the film. This is the commentary track, which I understand is the same commentary track which you can find on the earlier Blu-ray, the Warner Brothers Blu-ray. However, this Blu-ray commentary track had Martin Scorsese and Amy Robinson. It also had Martic Martin. And for whatever reason, Martic Martin's comments don't appear, at least I didn't find them, to appear in this selected scene commentary. So what the selected scene commentary does is, I understand there are some, let's call them blank spots where there's no talking being had on the commentary track. So maybe those parts are removed, but also some parts where Martic Martin is giving commentary track, those are also removed. And you can find them, I think, here, and they cover a good portion, say, around the middle of the film. Around and after a very famous sequence that involves a pool hall fight. But in the selected scene commentary track, as appears here, after that sequence, then there's a whole bit of the film that's gone, and it goes straight into a separate part where Scorsese is then talking. It's with the scene after some activity has been had, and Johnny Boy and Charlie are out on the street alone, just talking on a street corner somewhere. So it's a very interesting thing. And he does mention here Scorsese and Amy Robinson. It doesn't mention Martic Martin. So just keep that in mind. The comments from Martic Martin, I think, are really wonderful. So if you can get the earlier complete commentary track elsewhere, I strongly recommend it. You will be getting something that is without his comments, although Martic Martin does appear elsewhere in the supplements, and we'll get to that momentarily when we get to some of the other supplements. But we do still get the selected scene commentary track as it's described here. And the comments from Amy Robinson about her working on the set, working with Scorsese, certain aspects of her performance. There are aspects of, say, sexuality and nudity that are also remarked upon as examples here. So she mentions those and other matters, and working in this context and environment. And also Scorsese too, speaking about the inspiration for this work, certain shots and scenes, how this came from a kind of real life aspect. This is also true in the earlier discussion with, or the earlier supplement with Linklater, how there were certain real life events that could be said to be part of the dialogue of inspiration that led to Martin Scorsese creating this film, Mean Streets. So the selected scene commentary is here. It is not complete, as far as I can tell, but it is, I think, it's good to have. And the fact that it is a selected scene doesn't, I think, it's better than not having it at all. It's an interesting, curious way of doing the commentary. I'm not sure why it wasn't decided upon to say use the commentary track and then actually have it as being part of the the main feature, and then you can just press the audio key, and then you can have that as be the audio option. So then you can have the option of listening to it also, because commentary tracks, when it's done that way, can also be listened to when you watch the 4K disc. So for whatever reason, it's not the case, or at least as far as I can tell with my disc. But in any event, it's better than not having it at all. And I don't want to take away from the great comments from Amy Robinson and from Martin Scorsese, which I think are very valuable and very wonderful. In any event, that is the selected scene commentary, again, described as being from 2004. Next is A Body Among Other Bodies. Now, this is a Criterion supplement. It says, this video essay by author Imogen Sarah Smith was produced by the Criterion Collection in 2023. And so this is a video essay with Imogen Sarah Smith's commentary over this visual essay. It's approximately 29 minutes, so close to 30 minutes. This is fantastic. This is absolutely fantastic. And I join the chorus of people who would love to see Imogen Sarah Smith's commentary track. I listened to this video essay and I think, oh, it would have been great to also have had a new commentary track from her talking about Mean Streets. But maybe we can hope that that possibility for other releases in 2024 and beyond might have that possibility going forward. But for now, we can have this video essay, which is brilliant, by the way. She speaks, for instance, about the links to how, I mean, this is regarded oftentimes as a maybe gangster film, I think for good reason. It can also be regarded as a film about youth and kind of growing up. And one of the, I think, cinematic precedents for this film could be said to be Federico Fellini's I Vitelloni. And so there are references, I think, to Fellini, as well as to the French New Wave and Nouvelle Vague. And also, there's a lot to be had here about the way that culture and cultural, say, sort of contextual, cultural context is established here or shown here, all the way down to things like hand gestures, say touching of bodies, like touching the hand touching the shoulder or putting one's hand around someone else. So that type of body touch camaraderie is also showing signals, and those signals can either be a type of warmth and acceptance, or it might be a cloaked threat or something in between, or might be even something more sinister or perhaps more innocent, depending on the context and what they are. So these gestures and how these are shown by Scorsese and the camera, I think, are part of the way in which then Imogen Sarah Smith makes the argument, I think, very, very successfully about how this is a film that could be read, as I say, showing the corporeal, making flesh that which is ethereal and spiritual. And it's this idea of making flesh, making real, making corporeal, something that you can touch and feel, all the way down to the hand gestures, but also making real, making flesh, these concepts that are religious and maybe also, in a way, something that is very spiritual and transformative. But this idea of transformation and spiritual, they have this body component, or they have the feelings or the inspirations or the idea of salvation or transformation. This is made flesh in the story arc of Charlie and company here, which I think is such a key component. Again, it goes to the very essence of Mean Streets, or the reading of Mean Streets, a la religion and violence and the social context, and the idea of the characters living or being the embodiment of the corporeal body, flesh embodiments of their spiritual journeys. And so this link between the spiritual and the corporeal, I think, is incredibly important. And Imogen Sarah Smith's statements here are incredibly convincing and very well established and very well argued. There's also a moment here, I never realized this until she mentions this here in this video essay, which is, I mentioned earlier in the video, there's an example early on in the film where we see a shot of Charlie, the Harvey Keitel character, entering the bar or walking around the bar with the Rolling Stones song Tell Me on the soundtrack, and you see him gliding, he's almost sliding with his, waving his his shoulders and elbows about, just having a good time. He is the center of attention. He is at that moment. He is at the height. He is he is the king. He is at the very height of his power and prominence, as it were. And that camera shot is fixated on him physically from a perspective, a POV standpoint, from a certain point of view anyway, a POV from a certain point of view. But in any event, it's done in that gliding way, which is very seductive and very, very bravura. But then there is a very similar mirror shot somewhat later in the film, in the bar, where the camera is fixated on his face, and it's almost like a helmet cam, wherein everything is still. His head and face are fixed in the frame, but everything around him is bobbling. So this is a very similarly created shot where the camera is fixed on his body, so that his body or his face remains constant in the frame, but everything else around him becomes a variable. But they are mirror in the sense that while one shows a kind of confidence of a gliding through space, another shows the frenzy and chaos. It's almost like a visual representation of Charlie's own downfall, even if he might not even realize it. So that was an example of how brilliant this essay is. I think this is really brilliant. This is a tour de force. Absolute tour de force. So Imogen Sarah Smith's essay, A Body Among Other Bodies. This is approximately 29 minutes. Wow. Next, Kent Wakeford, the director of photography, is Kent Wakeford. And here we have, in the following interview recorded in 2011, cinematographer Kent Wakeford reflects on shooting Mean Streets, his first narrative feature film, and his first time working with director Martin Scorsese. This is from 2011, approximately 19 minutes. He speaks in English, but I understand that the program itself, I think, was made, you can tell by the titles used, it was made for the French language. So, Instinctive Light, but I've never seen this program before, so it's my first time seeing this. So it was very informative, very instructive, and he's talking too about, again, this really interesting paradox about the production, about how actually a very, very, relatively speaking, small amount of running time was actually footage shot actually in New York. He cites 6 minutes, which, if that's the case, wow. That is really fascinating. And then he also talks too about working with Martin Scorsese, this idea of the first feature film, narrative film, using handheld in certain scenes. I mean, there's I mentioned a very famous scene of a pool hall fight brawl, and there's a way in which handheld camera is used very effectively in that. But also how the camera is also mounted in other scenes, and it has this gliding way of working. And I mentioned too, as an example, some ways that the cameras are mounted and showing characters talking at a table, or maybe mounted from a perspective that is showing the behind from the back, and showing the character like Charlie gliding and almost flying through space. So there's a way in which there's like certain fixed mounted control of the camera in certain scenes on the one hand, but then it shows a type of frenzy and chaos of the handheld freedom on the other, and etc. So great. The camera work is one of the key aspects of the success of this film, and Kent Wakeford's contribution is undeniable. So, and he talks here about certain developments of cinematography and camera work and operating, and the way that the director engages with it now versus, quote unquote, the doing it old school, in a manner of speaking. So it's an interesting way that he closes out this conversation. I'm not a cinematographer or director of photography, so I've never made a film, so I don't know the specifics of this, but I can, generally speaking, understand the gist of his comments here. It's a very interesting perspective. So, but in any event, that's the discussion with Kent Wakeford. This is approximately 19 minutes. Wow. Next, we have Martin. So I mentioned before how Martin had been a feature of, his comments had been a feature in, say, the commentary track that had appeared elsewhere. But here, for the Criterion release, we have a section of a documentary, and it's described here. Presented here are 2 excerpts from the 2008 documentary, Marduk, Baghdad to Hollywood, directed by Rami Katrib and Evan York, which features Mean Streets co-writer Martin, co-writer director Martin Scorsese, journalist Peter Biskin, and filmmaker Amy Heckerling. This is approximately totally 9 minutes, and here we have Martin, who is one of the key collaborations, one of the key relationships. When he's talking about the landscape of early 1970s cinema, film school, New York University Film School. Martin Scorsese works. This is incredible, very important. And so Martin here is seen speaking maybe directly to the camera about his life and how he changed the trajectory of his studies because he really loved film, and he discovered the film program, which is a new emerging thing at the time. And this was a very exciting thing, and going to film school and meeting these other great film artists and students, such as Martin Scorsese. And the rest, as they say, is history. And he mentions a little bit later about how this changed everyone's lives. Everyone who's involved in this film, their lives changed. So it's wonderful to think back on that. And also he speaks too about working with Scorsese. Scorsese is there in some of the discussion too. They're sitting together and they're reminiscing about very important figures during the film school days. Haig Manoogian is mentioned, also working on some of the short films. It's not just Hugh Murray or Italian American. And then it leads to a discussion about the inspiration and creation, how Mean Streets became Mean Streets, also Who's That Knocking at My Doors, etc. So, and then other people are mentioned or shown here in terms of the way in which the films, collaborations, and art of Martin and others really paved the way in terms of inspiring them. So. This is great. Again, to show Martin is also very important. So it's great to see Martin highlighted in this way in this special feature. So please check this out if you can. Next we have Martin Scorsese, Back on the Block. And this is a featurette that I think was also, yes, it was featured in the earlier Blu-ray from Warner Brothers, for example. But it says, this vintage featurette was produced by Warner Brothers in 1973, for the theatrical release of Mean Streets. This is approximately 7 minutes. It has, it's interesting. It's shot in a way that it feels almost like part of the cinematic landscape of another short film called Italian American. So it has that type of feel to it. You actually see Martin Scorsese sitting at the table with his mother, and you hear comments too about how say aspects of the street and landscape. So a very interesting take. This is Back on the Block, approximately 7 minutes. Again, this type of vintage promotional or featurette or featurette in keeping with the release of Mean Streets. Then we have the trailer, and so the trailer is also an interesting aspect of this, and that rounds out the discussion of the supplements. So, wow, some really interesting choices. For the most part, what we'd seen in earlier releases are carried over for the most part. An interesting choice about the commentary track, as I mentioned. Again, I can only speculate as to why that occurred, but it's better to have that than to have nothing at all. Although it would have been interesting to have this being made available in terms of the main feature, or also having a new commentary track commissioned. Again, these are things that could have been really interesting had they occurred. But what we have here is utterly splendid. It's great to see from the perspective of people like Kent Wakeford and Martin, and then also Scorsese in the discussion with Richard Linklater, and also from an academic critical viewpoint, the great essay by Imogen Sarah Smith. I think it really helps to round out kind of a full-blooded, a full-bodied picture of what Mean Streets is, and it's a great, I think, jumping-off point. This supplement section is a great jumping-off point for anyone who is keen on maybe discovering more about this film. I mean, there's many writings, many critical essays have been done on this work, as well as the film itself. So I think this is a wonderful place to go in terms of a further enriching discovery and journey into the world of Mean Streets. And now let us conclude our conversation on this Criterion release by speaking about other details regarding, say, the packaging and the presentation and the cover art design. As I mentioned, this is utilizing the plastic casing, and I've already put the 2 discs back into the inside of the case here. And so you can see this this top disc is the 4K UHD disc. So the Criterion C is in a white, with the background being in red, and the title Mean Streets in this black lettering, whereas the Blu-ray disc, which is behind here, as you can see, it has the Criterion C in red, and the background in white, or this creamy white. And then we have the other side of the disc casing housing the booklet. And I've just removed it or the fold-out, I should say, and I've just removed it for purposes of the video discussion today. And look at this artwork. I really love this artwork and the use of the font, which is, I think, very much in keeping with the type of font that I understand was used for a lot of the promotional materials. But this artwork design is really wonderful, which is also repeated in the, it's also used in the various disc menus that we've seen here. I should point out the art director Sarah Habibi, Eric Skillman, designer Drusilla Adeline, Sister Hyde, our dear friend Sister Hyde, has done it again with wonderful artwork designs here. Just great, and it's carried over into the wonderful leaflet fold out here. Great design work from Sister Hyde, our dear friend. You have done it again. Well done. Brilliant stuff. And then art production coordinator William Breeze and art assistant Julie Sussman. So I'm very pleased with the way this looks. It would have been interesting to have had this in the Digipack box or the packaging, but that's okay. I'm totally okay with the plastic casing as it's used here. The fold out, I've said it before, I'll say it again, I'm not a fan of the fold out. I'd much rather have the staple booklet, but we do get the artwork or other aspects of the artwork here and elsewhere, the Sister Hyde artwork, and also an essay, Lucy Sante, Rites of Passage, which is a really great essay. Again, I strongly recommend you watch the film first, and then after you watch the film, you can read the great essay here, which is called Rites of Passage. So please check that out if you can. So that concludes what it was that I wanted to say about this Criterion release, this Scorsese film, Mean Streets. A very important film in the context of Scorsese's filmography. It's a film that reminds me of a lot of things in terms of my own cinema journey and how we responded to it then and how we respond to it now, courtesy of this very interesting release from the Criterion collection of this work, which is Mean Streets. All right, my dear friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well. And please keep on watching a lot of great movies, including Mean Streets, including films by Scorsese, including films in the Criterion collection, and beyond. So until the next video, my dear friends, stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.